My name is Mary Conquest. I'm your host for Safety Labs, the podcast where we explore the human side of safety to support safety professionals. We move past regulations and reportables to talk about the core skills of safety leadership: empathy, influence, trust, rapport. In other words, the soft skills that help you do the hard stuff. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Hi there. Welcome to Safety Labs. The study of an accident or disaster often leads to examining the safety systems within which the event took place. These systems are comprised of protocols, equipment, and communications that are put in place with the best of intentions. But, as mice and men have discovered, intentions sometimes have unintentional consequences. Today we'll be discussing the issues brought up in our guest's seminar, Understanding Disasters, which is an introduction to the history of technology as a link between history, engineering, social sciences, philosophy, religion, and the arts. Edward Tenner is the author of the books such as The Efficiency Paradox, Our Own Devices, Why Things Bite Back, and most recently, Why the Hindenburg Had a Smoking Lounge, Essays in Unintended Consequences. He's a lecturer, writer, speaker, and consultant with specialties as diverse as interface design, risk, resilience, bioethics, and media history. Over the past 30 years, his scholarship has been associated with institutes such as Princeton, the University of Pennsylvania, Rutgers University, and the Smithsonian Institution. He's currently a lecturer with the Princeton First Year Lecture Seminar Program. And Edward joins us from Princeton. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
I think as humans, we all want to understand why things go wrong, but I'm curious about what sparked your interest in going further in examining the issue and developing this seminar.
The seminar started in 2012 when I was invited to give a keynote at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan on the 100th anniversary of Titanic in connection with an exhibition of Titanic artifacts and the showing of a 3D version of James Cameron's film. And in preparation for that, I decided not just to review everything or sample everything, because there have been hundreds or thousands of books and articles, but to look at what people were saying before Titanic was launched, how people thought of safety before Titanic and that class of ships was launched. And what I found was really surprising. They were very much concerned with safety. There was not a climate of hubris or pride, but they were looking at other issues. They were looking at other problems. And the biggest problem was fog, because there had been collisions of ships with icebergs, but the real hazard, it seemed to people then, was one ship colliding with another in the fog, which happened years later with the Andrea Doria in 1956 under very similar conditions, by the way. So the more I looked, the more I saw how preoccupied people were with fog. For example, there was a book that was published in the late 1890s about the wreck of a ship called the Titan, and people said how prophetic it was, but what they overlooked was that the Titan was wrecked in a fog, and the fog was also associated with most of the other celebrated disasters of the time. So you can see that from the point of view of the captain and the White Star Line and the passengers, it was clear that on a clear night, they did not have the most characteristic feature of past disasters. And not only that, what I discovered was that in the case of another ship, the Republic, a few years earlier, the limited number of lifeboats proved enough to save everybody or almost everybody on board after the ship was struck by another ship in the fog and the Marconi telegraph summoned aid from other vessels. So looking back, what struck me was that the people running the White Star Line and Titanic were at the top of their fields. And I discovered later how many of the great disasters were really created by highly elite, competent people who had overlooked something.
Yeah, so I would like to step back a little bit and set the stage with the description you've given of your seminar. So you call it an introduction to the history of technology as a link between history, engineering, social sciences, philosophy, religion, and the arts. And you say that it's run, quote, in the spirit of cooperative investigation of issues in different times and places that reflect how American and other cultures have dealt with risk, and especially why so many disasters have resulted from errors of judgment by highly competent people. So you in the seminar you look at 6 different disasters. So one of them was of course the Titanic, and you mentioned some of the things. So I'd depending on how much time we'd have, I'd kind of like to go through each disaster and ask kind of a series of similar questions about context, about what people had learned, and how the event maybe changed future disaster preparedness, if I may.
Well, I'd say the most interesting or surprising other disaster that we discuss is one that is not nearly as well known, although it was the most severe aviation accident in history, the Tenerife Islands collision of two 747s on the runway. And that's especially interesting because the pilot who was responsible was the star of the KLM fleet. He was an instructor who taught safety to other pilots. He was featured in KLM advertising. He was a poster boy for the risks of being a leak. But what was especially interesting there was that his reaction to the delay in the fog, by the way, on Tenerife, and his decision to take off was influenced by a law that the Dutch government had passed to prevent disasters when pilots were overworked. And the idea was that if he spent too much time in the air, that he faced criminal penalties. He faced jail time, and at the very least, he faced losing his license. So he was in a kind of panicky mood, and he disregarded signals that should have made him stop and think. There were many other factors. In fact, one of the things that I bring out in the case of Tenerife was the Swiss cheese model, which was formulated by a scholar named James Reason, and that is when there are a series of little things that each in its own way was not really fatal, but when they lined up in the wrong way, proved to be disastrous. So if one thing had been done differently, maybe one thing out of nine, 8 or 9 different parameters, the disaster wouldn't have happened. But what struck me about it was simply the great distinction of the pilot who was responsible for the disaster, and also how legislation can be counterproductive.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about expertise. How is expertise itself a form of liability? Like, is it a risk in itself, or how did that play out in this case?
But expertise is great most of the time. Where expertise runs a risk is when the expert has a successful playbook and it works again and again. But the expert has not been following many changes, some of them subtle, that have been occurring that are changing the equation. And this is true in so many different cases. It's true, for example, in police investigations. One of the papers that students wrote was about the Yorkshire Ripper case in England, in which there were very experienced, distinguished police investigators, but they made a lot of fatal assumptions based on their experience and their prejudices, which were also very important and which were part of their standard and successful operating. So they interviewed the real perpetrator at least 8 times, and they passed over him because he seemed to be a regular bloke who was, hanging out with his chums, and he just didn't look like a serial killer. And then some hoaxer sent a letter or a series of letters claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper. And instead of making sure that person who sent it really knew details that were not made public, they say, aha, now we have a clue. Now we can pursue this. And the person also sent a tape, and they played the tape, and they took it to a language expert, a dialect expert, who told them that this was a Geordie accent. So they were looking for somebody originally from the north of England, whereas the person who did it was really a local person. So in their zeal to take advantage of the evidence they had rather than to examine it critically, they totally missed the point, and quite a few women died needlessly as a result of this mistake, and yet they were some of the most respected people. They generated so much paper in their investigation that it nearly collapsed the floor of the police headquarters.
The other question I wanted to ask a little bit or tease out is the idea of context, right? So you talk about assumptions. Every culture at every point in time, there are kind of underlying assumptions. And in here, it was the character of the person that they were interviewing. And in the context of the Titanic safety measures, they were looking in one direction rather than in another, metaphorically speaking. How does I kinda wanna ask 2 things. How does contemporary context play a role? But also, is it is it escapable? Is there any way to, I don't know, think outside or, get outside that context? Because we're kind of all steeped in it, aren't we?
Yes, that's a question. That's a question that has come up in the discussions. What's hindsight? Where are we? The Germans have a phrase, a wonderful word, Besserwisser. Like people who like now we know better. These people were so foolish. And one of the purposes of historical study is to question the idea that we are smarter than these ancestors of ours and older contemporaries of ours, and we could never have made that mistake, and we probably couldn't, but we probably are making other mistakes. For example, one of the cases we study was the handling of COVID by the Biden administration. There's a book about that by two Princeton political science professors who are going to be guest speakers in next year's seminar if it proceeds. And what they said was that the Biden administration was so narrowly focused on one model of dealing with pandemics that they overlooked, first of all, the economic and educational costs of prolonged closure of schools, for example, but also the rise of social media that made the control, and especially of influencers, that made the control of conventional media much more difficult than it had been in the days of the Salk vaccine, for example. Now, it wasn't that there weren't people in the media then who were attacking the government. Walter Winchell, for example, broadcast the false rumor that the government was stocking up on thousands of little coffins for the children that would be killed by the vaccine. And that resulted in 150,000 parents removing their children from the trial. So it did have consequences. But the point of it was that with a limited number of mainstream media at the time, you could control the messaging very easily. What they should have done was to really use social media on their own, to have a campaign consulting with experts on that was really pitched to reassure people and to promote the establishment view, which I happen to agree with. So it isn't that you necessarily lose faith in the establishment. But I think if the establishment has too much faith in itself, and if the government says this is science and everything else is nonsense, it's anti-science, it should be banned, that has a paradoxical effect because of something called reactance. And reactance is simply that if you press people in the wrong way, they will rebel by becoming even more strident in opposing it, and that's something that has to be combated in a strategy for scientific communication. So I was really struck by how many people who were not at all MAGA people have become really critical of the Biden administration's handling of the pandemic, especially after the first few months, when there was a national consensus about it.
Okay, I'm going to come back to this and talk about the other disasters that you mentioned, the other questions that I have sort of in terms of occupational health and safety, but I do have to take a quick break. Workers in shipping and receiving are under a lot of pressure. Time is money and safety isn't always top of mind. Plus, we all make mistakes. When it comes to standard utility knives, those mistakes can be painful and costly, taking a worker out of production and impacting their quality of life. So why not take the exposed blade out of the equation? The clever Eco Exchange XD does just that. Designed for quick use, the Eco Exchange XD features smooth cut technology, a design that helps you cut smoothly and quickly again and again. Its recessed blade and blade guard help keep fingers away from the blade edge. Its hook design is perfect for grabbing and slicing pallet banding and shrink wrap. And once that's gone, you can pull it through corrugate smoothly, ergonomically, and without any material clogging the blade. The blade head is engineered to be 50% stronger than similar blades and cuts through a mile of corrugated before it needs to be replaced. As a bonus, the Eco Exchange XD helps meet company ESG goals. It's made from 100% recycled plastic and the handle is reusable. So when the time comes, you only need to replace the blade head. The EcoXL XD is rigorously tested and proudly made in the USA. Want to give it a try? Get free samples by going to safetylabspodcast.com/samples. For quality you can count on, get clever. Okay, let's get back to our discussion. Okay, so we've talked about the Titanic and the context in which they were working. And we've talked about the 747s in terms of expertise and unintended consequences of legislation. Is there anything out of those two that you can think of that kind of occupational health and safety professionals who are tasked with creating these systems, what can they learn from those? How should they focus their perspective when they're trying to develop these systems?
Those may not be the best case. One example that comes to mind right away is the elevator lockouts in the World Trade Center, which is another unit of the seminar. There was a problem of people who were trapped in elevators in buildings like that, very tall buildings, trying to pry open the doors to escape between floors, which could be very dangerous. So, to prevent that, there was a mechanism that kept the doors closed until the first responders could come and rescue them, and that was something that worked very well. Tragically, at the time of the World Trade Center attacks, there were many people who died because they were trapped in elevators, and they could not open the elevators because of those devices. So that was one case in which a safety technology could bite back. Another case from a surprising source occurs in the reports that Franz Kafka filed when he was a safety inspector. A lot of people are unaware that Franz Kafka's career began as an inspector for an occupational insurance fund that was run by or subsidized by the Austro-Hungarian government in Bohemia. And he visited sawmills, and what he found was that the blade guards that had been installed in sawmills to protect workers' fingers became clogged with chips, and there were terrible injuries that occurred when workers tried to clear the chips without having disengaged the mechanism. So his reports, by the way, are a really I started out in German history, and so I read the reports in the original, and they're really some of the most beautifully written bureaucratic reports, even if the subjects were horrendous. They were some of the most beautifully written bureaucratic reports that I've read, and this is why Franz Kafka, when the Czech nationalists took over the what became Czechoslovakia after the First World War, he was one of the very few German-speaking workers, one of the few very German-speaking executives that they wanted to keep.
So I think I suspect, I don't know actually, that the reason they didn't want to disengage the machines was a commercial one. They didn't want to slow down production and the reason I mention this is that I think that that tension between commercial requirements and safety, it took place in the Titanic where they removed some lifeboats for the view. I think the Challenger was another example.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Schedule pressure is a huge factor, and schedule pressure accounted for the custom of captains on the North Atlantic running their ships at close to full speed, even in the fog and under dangerous conditions. And this appeared in the British hearings on Titanic. There were two sets of hearings on Titanic, and part of the seminar is the contrast between the two. So the American hearings were really ones of high indignation that the White Star Line had really messed up, that people had been negligent. But the British ones had an element of whitewashing, but they also really brought out a lot of interesting things. And one of them was the testimony of one captain after another that the custom was to keep as close as possible to the schedule in fog and other adverse conditions. And there were important economic reasons for that because the transatlantic trade was really on a very tight schedule. You would have maybe 3 ships, and you would be guaranteeing people that they would arrive on time. The passengers would be very unhappy if they didn't. And so the passengers were tacitly agreeing about taking the risks. That's one of the big themes of the seminar. I call that communities of expectations. So everybody was kind of on board with that. Nobody, to my knowledge, was saying, "Hey, look, these ships don't have enough lifeboats." I found nothing of that when I was searching electronically for the discussions of safety before the Titanic wreck. There were many other things that were really not mentioned, and the Andrea Doria was another perfect case because the captain was also an extremely respected captain, Captain Calamai. And he was later blamed for it, but he was really under pressure because of the high overhead costs of longshoremen if he arrived late. And not only that, suppose Captain Smith, I told the seminar, suppose Captain Smith had said, "Safety first, we're going to reduce speed or even heave to for a while, and we're going to make sure that we don't hit an iceberg." Now, what would they have said on arrival in New York late? Would they have said, "Thank God Captain Smith saved us from the worst shipwreck of all time"? Or would they have said, "This old guy was so cautious that I had to spend another night in the hotel, and I missed having the party I was planning with my friends"? So we look back and we are sort of indignant, and this comes out in films about Titanic. We're sort of indignant, but when you look at it in the context of practice and of the pressures that not only the companies but also the passengers put on the companies, it becomes understandable. And of course, after Titanic, one result of the event is that people are still much less likely to complain about a company saying that some delay or cancellation was a result of safety. Before Titanic, I don't think that was that was a thing as much as it is today.
Well, and I think that their tremendous marketing about the unsinkable liner probably played into that as well, right?
What I believe about the origin of that unsinkable phrase. And by the way, I gave a TEDx talk, which may still be online, called "Thinking About the Unsinkable," about Titanic. But the unsinkable line probably derives from an unfortunate public relations episode in which the New York representative of the White Star Line, upon hearing the initial reports that the ship had gone down, contrary to the contrary to the earliest reports. He said that's impossible. The Titanic is unsinkable, and I think that it was that remark, although other people had said similar things before, but I think it was that remark that settled in the public mind.
So that's interesting. It's again, that's a hindsight thing. So my impression had been that this was their marketing beforehand, and what you've said is that that may have settled into our collective memory in a different way, may have happened differently than people tend to think. So I was just thinking as you were talking about that, the hero on the Hudson, Captain Sully.
Sonberger, yeah.
Yeah, he succeeded, and so he's a hero. Had he not succeeded, I imagine that this story would be well, certainly it would be different for anyone who was injured or killed, but I imagine that the esteem of him would be different, and I think there was quite a tussle about the legacy of the decisions he made at the time.
We don't study non-disasters. Maybe we should. Maybe that might be that might be a unit like disasters that disasters that almost happened, or heroic things that could have been disastrous. That's an extremely interesting point. I have not studied that in detail, simply because Sully is so often elevated to the like the pinnacle of skill, and how you can't replace the pilots with autopilot. So without saying anything negative about him, I do think that it may be a case of hindsight too.
What do you think we're learning? So I'm gonna read out the list of you had said the list of disasters that were kind of mentioned in the seminar. So there's the Titanic, the 747 collision you mentioned, the Challenger, World Trade Center, COVID, and the LA fires. So each of those happened at very different times in the world. What do you think? Is there a through line of adapting or understanding or learning from these disasters? It might be a hard question because they're not even the same type of disaster, but do you think we're learning, and how so? How do you think we might be learning from these?
We've always learned in specific domains. So with each disaster, there are new safety technologies and precautions. For example, the Iroquois fire, one of the great theater fires in Chicago in the early 20th century, that gave us the panic bar. The panic bar was invented as a response to the hundreds of deaths when people were trampling each other, because people didn't know which way the door was supposed to open, and so the you will see that everywhere. And without the Iroquois fire, I mean, there probably would be panic bars, but the panic bars, there was a company called Von Duprin, which was really like a fictitious name made up of the names of the founders. But the Von Duprin company pioneered that genre of safety advice. So you can all often find that some important safety technology arises as a response to a disaster. That's one of the themes of the seminar. But there's another theme besides the Swiss cheese, and that's what a one expert called the Gray Rhino. And the Gray Rhino is inspired by the way in which some people might be approaching a dangerous animal to get a better photograph. And they come closer and closer, and they know that there's a danger that the beast will charge, but they still feel, well, I have some way to go. And then there's a fatal charge. So the Gray Rhino in safety replies to something that was known to be unsafe, and there were moves to remedy it. There were plans. People were proposing a budget. For example, while it wasn't a disaster in anything but a reputational sense, the Louvre robbery. So there were reports of the deficiencies of Louvre security for years and years. And the Macron government said, "Oh, we've got a 900 million euro plan to upgrade everything, new reception, special gallery for Mona Lisa, and all that." But meanwhile, the burglars were not waiting for that. And the system of of surveillance also, although there was a camera that apparently was pointed in the right direction, the guards monitoring the all the cameras were distracted, or maybe there weren't enough of them. So gray rhinos are situations where people may recognize a need but feel it can be deferred, and the gray rhino might be the most dangerous type in our time because we recognize it, and yet we think we have more time than we do. This may also have been a factor, for example, in the Lisbon tram tragedy, which is still being investigated. That there may have been reports of problems. It was really an old system that had been kind of patched up over the years. Supposedly, the cable was inspected. I still haven't seen the final report about it, but gray rhinos probably are the most dangerous category for us because they're based on a recognition of a safety need, but also the idea that we can pass the cost on to the next person who holds the job. And meanwhile, we're staying within our budget.
Yeah, I think sometimes I know even in my personal life, if I'm planning to do something, if I make a thorough plan, sometimes I feel like I've done it. And I wonder if that's similar, like writ large across Macron knew that there was this plan. Well, that's great, but a plan is a stack of paper until it's actually put into place. So it's interesting to me the human psychology of like, well, we've got a plan. I'm sure that all these disasters that we're discussing, there were plans. I mean, not for the murderer, but there were plans to take care of safety deficiencies. There were gray rhinos everywhere, is what I'm saying.
Mhm. Yes, yes, a herd of gray rhinos.
One way you described the seminar was problem-centered humanities and time traveling anthropology. There's two threads I want to pull out of that. One of them is time traveling. What do you think the effect of, so for example, we talk about the Titanic. That's the furthest away in this list. The most recent one is the LA fires. How does time help us or hinder us from understanding what went wrong in disasters?
Time has it's really a double effect. So in one way, we have a greater, because we have such a greater distance from an event like Titanic, we can be like more anthropological in the sense that these people are different from us in many ways, our ancestors. And so we can look back and say, well, some things are really admirable, other things were foolish, and it's much harder for us to talk about ourselves and to look at the gaps in our own understanding, contemporary events. The L.A. fires, for example, were really a classical gray rhino situation in the sense that fire experts knew all about the chronic risks of fires in that environment. If you read environmental histories of the West, that's a classic theme. And people in the area also realized that, but life was just so pleasant that they didn't want to take drastic steps to modify the vegetation around their homes, for example. There was a geographer who had a wonderful idea about how the very features that make landscapes attractive to people are also sources of danger. The tectonics of California are also responsible for the earthquakes, and the Florida's wonderful, all the beaches of Florida also make it more vulnerable to hurricanes and to the rising waters. So that human culture has a tendency to flock to the most dangerous areas, and there have been recent studies to show that in spite of all of these high profile fires, people still want to move to this so-called the wildland interface. They want to be out there in the country and have urban amenities. They want to be part of the power grid. So you have these have power lines that can start fires, and it's we can recognize these things, but it's harder for us because we're participants.
Do you think there's a way in which we just coast on hope? The idea that, well, we want to be optimistic that these things won't happen. Do we fool ourselves in that way?
Well, you could put it another way that a certain amount of self-deception is necessary for existence in today's world. If you look at the number of sociopaths who have access to the button, for example, uh, and you look at the risk of thermonuclear war, you could really go out of your mind contemplating that. So, a certain amount of denial is necessary for human existence.
Okay, the other thread I wanted to pull on from that earlier statement was the intersection between technical studies and the humanities. So, part of the stated goal of the seminar is to, quote, show engineering and science students how the humanities and social sciences can help planning and decision making in technical and executive professions. I'm wondering if you can expand on that within the context of safety as one of those kind of technical and executive professions.
Yes, well, in the case of safety, for example, one of the best papers was from an engineering student analyzing Fukushima and looking at the mentality of managers and how their passion for optimization led to a series of disastrous decisions. So that isn't the case of occupational safety, but it is a case of how thinking about safety can be a difficult thing, even in a culture like Japan, that's supposed to be so great at preparing for disasters and giving people the right equipment. And it really is. If you look, for example, at Japanese firefighting, it's especially adapted for densely populated areas. And Japanese firefighters have like amazing gymnastic abilities. It's very impressive. And yet, according to the students' research, on the level of of electric power generation, on the level of nuclear power, there was a regulatory capture that the government was really very easy on TEPCO, the utility operating the Fukushima plants. So again, they were really, although Japan supposedly is so expert in recovering from disasters and building to avoid disasters. On the other hand, when there are time pressures or financial pressures on the government, they seem to be as susceptible to the gray rhino effect as any other culture.
Is there, I'm not sure if cure is the right word, is there a way to get around the gray rhino effect?
Well, there is in a way, although to get around the gray rhino effect, you have to be able to persuade people to make difficult and expensive decisions before most people would agree that they were really necessary. They believe these things should be done eventually, but in the next cycle in somebody else's budget. And if there's an outcome of it, I think it's providing examples for students of how this thinking so often did lead to disasters. It's giving them a set of examples and especially a set of concepts. I was inspired in developing the seminar by a friend and colleague when we were both in the same fellowship program at Harvard. And I asked him when we were introduced what his field was. And he said, I don't have a field. I study problems. He was and is an applied mathematician who has applied mathematical techniques to everything from the world population to the communication of primates. And I decided that this was also a good idea for the humanities. Humanities should be problem centered, and humanists also should look for tools just about everywhere to have a holistic understanding of what they're studying. So, in studying Titanic, for example, we study the poetry and music that followed Titanic. We study the role of the memory of Titanic. I've been fascinated to read about how the Titanic industry in Belfast, including the Belfast Titanic Museum, has promoted a civic renaissance, and that probably every year the Titanic industry brings in more income than the inflation-adjusted cost of building Titanic.
Very, very interesting and strange.
Well, that's history. Reality is interesting and reality is strange.
This is true. Going back to the idea of expertise, in all of these cases, there are experts in their fields who are having to make decisions in a crisis. I'm sure that they know what regular protocol is, but sometimes the situation they're facing is not covered by regular protocol, or as you've said, sometimes there are influences that are competing. What are the ethical issues inherent in crisis decision making?
The most famous example of that is, the infamous trolley problem. That should you take a life to spare more lives of other people, and you can see this in some of these disasters, that some of these decisions were like that. One case is that some people have said that Captain Smith should have, or the officer who was in charge at the time, should have aimed the Titanic squarely at the iceberg, because Titanic then wouldn't have sunk, and hundreds of people in the bow would have been killed, but hundreds more, or thousands, 1,000 might have been saved. And but that kind of thinking ignores that reality is not this neat thought experiment, but is really probabilistic. If the captain had done that and all these people had been killed, they wouldn't say, "Thank God he averted the deaths of 1,000 more people." It's rather like the situation. I was interviewed at a program once, and the subject of the greater safety of self-driving automobiles came up, and I said, "You can talk about statistics all you want, but if your beloved grandmother is run over by an autonomous vehicle, would you tell them, 'Don't be so selfish. Don't you realize that the lives of 2.4 statistical grandmothers were saved?'" So these utilitarian calculus turns out to me to be really flawed.
So, when safety professionals are designing systems, procedures, protocols to manage workplace safety, what should they know, or what should they be aware of or be thinking about as far as crisis decision making is, and acknowledging that it's different from, regular flowchart logical thinking?
To me, the most important thing is to rehearse all contingencies, to have people prepared by simulations or other means to respond calmly and decisively to a crisis when it occurs, because no safety devices can be perfect. And one of the great successes of civil aviation is the systematic testing of people, their training, and their ability to respond to an emergency. One of the papers in the seminar was informed by a family member of the student who was a professional pilot. And one of the things I learned is that in the course of every flight, there are two or three disturbances or concerns, despite autopilot, that pilots have to respond to. But the safety record is really as impressive as it is because the training has been so good. On the other hand, in the case that she wrote about, the Air France 447, there was a case in which there was a gap in the training, and the gap was that there could be a situation in which there would be the captain on this long transatlantic flight would be sleeping, and there would be two junior officers who were in charge as pilot and co-pilot, and they had not been trained in that specific situation to communicate with each other. And that lack of communication, that lack of training for that specific case was the thing that ultimately doomed the plane. I mean, there were other factors, but so after that, of course, they did revise the training. But it's really important to exercise imagination. In the case of Air France, they should have realized, hey, this is a different situation. Now we have a different social configuration, and we need to be sure that people can communicate clearly, and that they don't have a kind of tug of war over what to do.
Speaking of your students' research, you had to do a fair bit of research before presenting on the topics, but then you're interacting with students throughout the seminar. How has that changed your perspective on any of the material? Is there anything that you kind of learned that surprised you or, yeah, changed your perspective?
Well, I had a lot of insight from the students, and the most satisfying thing to me, though, has been to encourage students to choose a final paper that matters to them, and to guide them in their research, to point out things that early drafts might not have shown. So I did my best to work with the students continuously, and part of that bargain was that they would not use AI beyond the AI that's already embedded in the Princeton databases. Because as I told them, Princeton spends, if you had to pay individually to use all the resources that you get in Princeton University libraries, that money would be more than tuition. So it's really important for students to learn how to use those resources. And there's a lot of research that shows that students who have relied on AI become less able to do original work because they have been so reliant on this that they haven't learned to do things the hard way. So part of our community of expectations is they do things the hard way, and I invest as much time as possible in helping them to do that.
If you had to boil down today's topics, and I know we've ranged pretty widely, into one actionable step that you would recommend to safety professionals listening, like what do you think is the most important takeaway for safety professionals?
The most important takeaway to me is there's probably something on the horizon. There are probably trends that they call them weak signals in disaster studies. There are probably weak signals. There are some things that are slowly creeping up on us, and I think the most important thing beyond what people are already doing is asking themselves: is there something or some unusual combination of factors, as there was in the case of Titanic, for example, unusual iceberg patterns, unusual atmospheric effects. Is there some unlikely combination that still could be a hazard? So it's sort of it might just saying, well, use your binoculars to look for gray rhinos on the horizon.
This is a more personal question. If you could go back in time to the beginning of your career, particularly in this, maybe not the beginning of your career, but the beginning of your professional interest in understanding disasters, is there a piece of advice that you might give yourself?
I can't say that there's any advice, and the reason is that I got into this by a totally unforeseeable sequence of successes and failures. Success in getting a great fellowship, and then failure to write a dissertation, although I did get and earned and got my degree. Failure to write the kind of dissertation that could get me a job in a competitive market. But that in turn exposed me to a lot of scientific research, first helping one of my graduate teachers, Bill McNeil, with his best-selling book, Plagues and Peoples, about epidemics and history, then helping the political scientist, Theodore Marmor, with a paper on Canadian and American healthcare policy. Those in turn helped get me a job at Princeton University Press as science editor, where I met scientists and engineers and learned about these concepts. So it would be impossible for me to devise a curriculum like that for somebody. It would be crazy. But to me, it's proof that there's a there's also a benevolent potential in in failures and the way reality is organized. So I couldn't say that I should have done anything differently. I don't regret, painful as it was at times, I don't regret anything that I've done, because it was necessary for me to prepare me to teach the seminar, and and like decades later, this is something that I felt that I was always meant to be doing.
That's interesting. I think that's a fairly accurate description of life is like an unattended, unforeseen series of successes and failures that lead you on a path that you would never have predicted.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
How can our listeners learn more about the topics in our discussion? We've mentioned your books. Are there any other resources, books, websites, organizations that you think are particularly interesting?
There are two writers who have been especially prominent that I would recommend because they are not so technical. They're very readable. One is Henry Petrosky, my late friend and colleague, who wrote a whole series of books on the importance of failure and how engineers learn from failure. And if you just go into any online bookstore, you will see them. The one that I especially recommend is a book called Engineers of Dreams that I reviewed years ago. It's about the history of bridge engineering. And one of the things he mentions there, and that practitioners should bear in mind, is the cycle of development and forgetting in safety technology. One thing that he brings out, based on a study of North Sea oil platform disasters, is that the engineers have a new design and they develop it and take it to greater scale, and it takes about 20, 20, 30 years. And then a disaster happens. And then they go back to the drawing board with a new design, and they take that and develop it, and it also reaches a breaking point. So people should be aware that there is a cycle of failure, and they should be conscious if something hasn't happened for 15 years. That is an especially dangerous time. That's something that we bring out in the studies of Apollo 1 and Challenger and Columbia, that people vow after each case, never again. We're never going to have a space disaster again, and they don't for 15 to 20 years, and then another one happens. So people should be aware of those cycles. And the other one is Charles Perrow's book, Normal Accidents, which is a sociological study of the role of what he calls tight coupling. I won't go into the technical definitions. Tight coupling of systems, and how some systems are inherently disaster prone. Sometimes they're necessary. And for example, he believed that nuclear power should be ruled out. But of course, he was writing that book before climate concerns became as urgent as they are. So I think if he were alive today, he might be putting it into the category of shipping, which he says is also like that. And one of the most interesting concepts that he introduces in the book is the subject of radar-assisted collisions. That is, that the use of radar, if people aren't careful about it, can lead to more disasters. And this was probably the case with the Andrea Doria, where the navigator of the Stockholm, which collided with Andrea Doria, was using a radar scope that had two scales, and he was using the wrong scale, so he thought that the Andrea Doria was 3 times farther than it really was. So there again, you have another kind of risk that's inherent in safety technology, which is the mode error. It's like an alarm clock that has two settings with the same readout, one setting for the time and the other for the wake up. But if you're not careful, you could, and AM and PMs. But if you're not careful, you can mix them up and miss your wake up time. But that's very different from another really tragic case of technicians who operated radiotherapy equipment with the wrong settings, and patients died as a result of that. So the machines had to be redesigned. So these are all classic cases of how progress sometimes happens through a very disastrous learning. So I think that some of those would have been avoidable if people had used more imagination and had been aware of phenomena like mode errors, which was the case in the case of the radiotherapy equipment.
That sounds fascinating. I'll put it on my ever-growing pile of books that I want to but have not read. Where can our listeners find you on the web?
I have a website, edwardtenner.com, and I link what I've written there. You can also go to the Milken Institute Review online. And I have written more recently for the Milken Review, especially on technology, than for any other publication. So if you want a sample of my writing, especially of pieces that have appeared since why the Hindenburg had a smoking lounge went to press, then you will find them there. The most recent, the newest one that's in press now is about whether we are getting dumber, and it's about James Flynn and his research on the history of IQ. So that should be out within the next week or so.
Interesting. Okay, and we will link to that in the show notes as well. That's our time for today. Thank you so much, Edward, for joining me.
Well, thank you, Mira. It's been great to be able to talk with you.
Thanks to our listeners and the Safety Labs team for all your support. Bye for now. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Until next time, stay safe.